In this second video on the domestic policies of George W. Bush, we'll look at his first term from the election of 2000 to the election of 2004. But before we get into these domestic policies, I should note at the outset that so much of Bush's presidency revolved around the September 11th, 2001 World Trade Center bombing, the planes flying into the World Trade Center, and the subsequent war on terror, the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, which are all covered in other videos. We're not going to talk about in this domestic videos, but that, of course, colored everything that happened otherwise. One way the whole war on terror and the bombing of the World Trade Center impacted Bush was in his popularity ratings. I mean, I should mention at the outset that right after the attack, Bush's popularity soared as the nation rallied around his commander-in-chief. But later, as the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq dragged on, his popularity began to suffer. Anyway, immediately following the 2001 attack, Congress passed the, and I quote, "Uniting and Strengthening America by Providing Appropriate Tools Required to Intercept and Obstruct Terrorism Act of 2001, unquote. That's quite a mouthful, but it was named that so it would match the acronym, the Patriot Act of 2001. The Patriot Act of 2001 affected all Americans, providing for the FBI to search telephone, email, and financial records without court orders. It allowed for the entry into homes without the owner's knowledge or consent, and it provided for the indefinite detention of immigrants. The law originally had a sunset provision, but Congress later passed extensions. The law, of course, was controversial, and in time, some of its provisions were ruled unconstitutional. In 2002, Bush signed legislation related to the war on terror that further impacted America, creating a whole new department, the Department of Homeland Security. It sort of combined agencies that exist in other departments previously. As part of this general reorganization, the government nationalized airport security under the Transportation Safety Administration, TSA. But before, there had been privately hired contractors doing airport security. But if you've ever been to the airport, you'll see them, the TSA agents. They're all federal employees, and they have been ever since the Bush administration. When Bush took office, the country's economy was still recovering from the dot-com bust and its subsequent recession in 2001, which, as one might expect, centered in the technology sector. Another area that lost jobs, however, was manufacturing, and here it was often caused by companies continuing to move production overseas, where labor costs and regulation were less. Throughout his presidency, Bush largely encouraged globalization and free trade, arguing that a globalized economy benefited America more than it cost it. And, without embracing globalization, America, he argued, would be left behind. In a related sense, Bush welcomed immigration, seeking to counter the Republican Party's growing nativist and protectionist element. Bush's embrace of Latin American immigration specifically undoubtedly reflected his Texas upbringing. He failed to pass comprehensive immigration reform, but notably denounced many conservatives who spoke poorly of Muslims after the 2001 terrorist attack. But of course, Bush was still, at his core, conservative. And early in his first term, he succeeded in passing two major tax cuts, the Economic Growth and Tax Relief Reconciliation Act of 2001 and the Jobs and Growth Tax Relief Reconciliation Act of 2003, which, we just kind of collectively refer to as the Bush tax cuts. The cuts reflected the continued dominance of supply-side economics in Republican circles since the Reagan years, and without a doubt they were significant. They totaled roughly 2% of the nation's gross domestic product. They lowered the estate taxes and the marginal income tax rates, and they increased deductions for marriage and children, among many other provisions. Federal taxes on stock dividends and capital gains even reached their lowest level since World War II. As passed at the time, the cuts had sunset provisions, but they were later eliminated. Republicans argued that the cuts stimulated growth. The Democrats complained that they aided the wealthy and added considerably to the national debt. Bush's devout evangelical religious faith in social conservatism was, obvious in his first term. He weakened requirements for religious organizations to separate religious and charitable activities for tax purposes, which Democrats claimed broke down the separation of church and state. Bush, undoubtedly aware of the importance of the socially conservative base, to his own Republican Party, created the White House Office of Faith-Based and Community Initiatives, and he promised additional federal actions on the social conservatives' behalf. Bush supported budget increases for science, but he strictly opposed abortion, and to the point of even prohibiting federally funded research on embryonic stem cells. Social conservatives, of course, believed that embryonic stem cells was immoral, but Democrats noted that so many medical advances would follow. Regarding environmental protection, Bush offered support rhetorically. He said he wanted to protect the environment and often named his policies with environmentally friendly terms. But his policies in reality worked to weaken environmental protections. Down at the core, Bush accepted the idea that, environmental protections are harmful to the economy. As Democrats claimed that he was serving his old oilman friends, Bush supported increased logging, grazing, and mining, and of course drilling on federally protected lands. He supported oil drilling in the pristine National Arctic Wildlife Refuge in Alaska, shown on the right here. He pulled the United States out of the Kyoto Accords, which Clinton had negotiated, and as more Republicans began at the time, more Republicans were arguing against the very notion of climate change, that it wasn't a problem at all and wasn't taking place, it was just bad science. Regarding pollutants, Bush proposed emission trading within a system of total ambient limits, not simply statutory restrictions on individual sources of pollution. Democrats and environmentalists argued that Bush's plan seemed reasonable just looking at it, but that in its implication it would actually allow additional pollutants into the air and water. While all of these actions kind of pointed to Bush's basic conservatism, he was more moderate regarding education, supporting compromise legislation that was negotiated with the liberal Massachusetts Democrat Ted Kennedy. Together, they got past Congress the bipartisan No Child Left Behind Act of 2002. Now, while many staunch conservatives wanted to decrease federal involvement in education, leaving it to the states, and didn't like this law, Bush encouraged it, and the law increased federal funding for education. And with this funding, however, Bush got stricter federal oversight, demanding school and strict accountability. The result was greater emphasis on testing, which in time led to criticism that too much emphasis was given to test and not enough to learning. Many Democrats also later argued that the funding increases were offset by the cost of implementing the new testing programs. In any event, this concludes the video on George W. Bush's first-term domestic policies.